tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody. Okay, today is June 9th, 2012. And today we are taking Sutta number 74 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is called the Dighanaka Sutta, and it's on page 603. It's a short sutta. Do you have it? Maybe you could move over to the seat. Okay, so this is a short sutta. It's a little dry, but still it's in some ways quite interesting. And apparently the sutta takes place very shortly after the beginning of the Buddha's ministry, because we can see from the end of the sutta that Sariputta, at the time the sutta begins, had not yet achieved arhatship, and then he achieves arhatship at the very end of the sutta. And so we know, at least from other texts, that Sariputta became the disciple of the Buddha, a monk, during the first year of the Buddha's teaching career. And so the sutta must take place sometime within that first year. And then we know also, after Sariputta became a monk, it's said that he spent 2 weeks in training, in meditation practice, before he achieved arhatship. So this sutta will take place probably in the second week of Sariputta's, after Sariputta's ordination as a monk. And the person who the Buddha speaks to in the sutta is it's a wanderer named Dighanaka. The word Dighanaka in Pali, it seems to be a sobriquet rather than a proper name. It means long fingernails. And so, since he was a wanderer, belonging to one of the ascetic communities, probably their practice was to abstain from cutting their fingernails. And so his fingernails would have grown very long. I think even in India today you could sometimes see ascetics like this who observe that practice. They grow very long hair, long beard, and they don't cut the fingernails, so the fingernails become very long. I think we see this also maybe in pictures of the Chinese immortals. Is that the case? The Taoist immortals? They have the long fingernails? No? They cut their fingernails. I've seen some pictures like that. Okay, now Dighanaka was not only a wanderer, but he was, according to the commentary, he was the nephew of Sariputta. According to some other traditions, Buddhist traditions, he was not the nephew, but some other relative of Sariputta. And so he had heard that whether nephew, his uncle, or his nephew, depending on which tradition one is following, had become a disciple of this monk that went by the name Gotama. And so he was apparently a skilled debater, this Dighanaka, and he thought that he would go to see the Buddha and argue him out of his position, engage him in a debate, and then defeat the Buddha in debate, and in that way win back his uncle or his nephew, Sariputta, to win him away from following this bad teacher called Gautama. Okay, so Dighanaka comes to the Buddha. This is when the Buddha is living at the Boar's Peak on the mountain Vulture Peak, which is outside of the city of Rajagaha. So Dighanaka comes to the Buddha, they exchange greetings, engage in some cordial introductory talk. How are you today? How is your health? And so on. Then Dighanaka sort of opens the debate by saying, my doctrine and view is this, that nothing is acceptable to me. And it's a little puzzling the way it's stated, and the text itself doesn't give any explanation of what he means by this. The commentary gives an explanation which I have to say I don't agree with. I don't find it to be particularly convincing. The commentary says that what Dighanaka means by this view, nothing is acceptable to me, he means that no type of rebirth is acceptable to him. And so according to the commentary, what Dighanaka is stating is that he completely rejects the idea of any kind of rebirth, and so he's an annihilationist, one who holds that at the end of his life, existence completely comes to an end and there's no continuation of consciousness or experience beyond the end of his life. That's the commentarial explanation, but first, it's not apparent in the statement itself, and it doesn't quite make sense to me. I would take just my own interpretation, though some other people agree with me, that what is intended by Dighanaka's view that nothing is acceptable to me is that no view is acceptable to me. In other words, he could be one of these extreme skeptics who hold that it's impossible for human beings to know to come to any kind of knowledge about matters beyond the range of immediate experience. So we can have no knowledge whether there's a life beyond this or not, whether there is any kind of super-sensible reality like Nibbana. So we can never decipher or understand any of the great pressing metaphysical questions. And so he's rejecting the possibilities, in a way rejecting all kinds of theoretical views about positions beyond the range of sensory experience. And he states his position apparently very forcefully, a little bit maybe aggressively or provocatively, like he wants to provoke the Buddha by indicating that since his view is that no view is acceptable to me, the implication for the Buddha should be that even your view won't be acceptable to me. So in a way he's indirectly challenging the Buddha. But the Buddha is also a very skilled debater, don't forget. And so the Buddha is going to pick up on his statement and turn the tables on him by turning his view against himself. So the Buddha says, this view of yours, that nothing is acceptable to me, isn't at least that view acceptable to you? Yes, so this seems to support the interpretation I just presented, that what Dighanaka is saying is that no view is acceptable to me. And so we can see the Buddha is contradicting that, or counteracting that, by asking him, isn't that view at least acceptable to you? Okay, and then Dighanaka replies, he says, if this view of mine were acceptable to me, Master Gautama, it too would be the same it too would be the same. Again, it's from the text itself, it's not completely clear what he means by this, so I have to give my own interpretation. What he seems to be saying is that even though he proposes this view that nothing is acceptable to me, but he's saying that even this view of mine is something that I don't hold to, don't cling to. Since if I were to take up this view and were to cling to it, then I would be accepting that view. And then I would fall into the same position as the positions of those whom I'm rejecting. Does anybody else have any idea of this? And before, I have to make a little announcement. Before anybody speaks, who has the microphone now? Boe has it. So we always want to get the questions recorded for the internet presentation. So before anybody asks a question or makes a comment, please take the microphone from Boe at the beginning, then hold on to it, and the next time somebody else has to comment, then you who have spoken should give the microphone to the next person to speak. In that way, each one who speaks then becomes the master of the microphone with the responsibility of passing it on to the next person. Anybody else have any understanding of this? Kathy, is that you? Katie.
I'm wondering if he's just pointing out to the sort of paradox of holding a view at all. Just really sort of poking a hole at the concept of holding a view is meaningful.
Wait, is this a question or?
Yeah, well, an explanation of the comment.
Okay, so say it again.
That the Buddha is pointing out the sort of futility or paradox in holding a view at all.
Well, don't forget, it's Dighanaka who's saying, if that view of mine were to be acceptable, that would be like it too. This would be like it too. So it's Dighanaka who's speaking at this point, not yet the Buddha. Okay, so now you hold the mic. You are now the master of the mic, and then we'll continue. Okay, just work with this hypothesis that the sense is that Dighanaka is saying that if he were to sort of grasp onto his own view, that would be like it too. In other words, he would then fall into the same trap as those who hold views that he's criticizing. He would be guilty of clinging to views. And generally the Buddha's attitude towards views is, first, he will distinguish between wrong views and right views. So in the Buddha's understanding that there's definitely a distinction between views that are wrong, views that are inaccurate, views that are misleading and harmful, and what is called right view, a view that corresponds to the nature of things. And so among the wrong views in the Buddha's analysis of views, there are generally 3 views which are set out as the worst kind of wrong views. And these are sometimes called the wrong views with fixed destination. Since somebody who adopts these views and then propounds them and insists on them dogmatically creates unwholesome karma with a tendency to lead to a bad rebirth. So these views, they're called in Pali don't want to frighten people away with a lot of poly terminology, but it's sometimes good for your notes just to know these terms. Okay, what's called Natikavada means, maybe we render this sometimes as the doctrine or teaching of, you could say, moral nihilism. Natika means literally there is not. And this is the view that denies that there's any, through our actions, that we create any karma, and it denies any existence beyond death. And so it holds that there's no point in doing anything good, no point in avoiding what is bad or unwholesome, because this is the only life we live, so we might as well enjoy ourselves to the utmost. And when death comes, whether one is considered a wise man or a fool, they both share the same fate. The body, made up of the four great elements, perishes, and the four elements just dissolve into, each one into its own universal body. The earth element of the body goes back to the earth, the water evaporates into the air, the heat of the body passes out into the atmosphere, and the breath comes to an end. And then the Buddha opposes this by holding that, we might call the Attikavada. This is the view that there is life beyond death, existence continuing beyond death. There is a law of karma, that our will deeds, our ethical deeds do have significance, and that we will reap the results of our action, our deeds in future lives. Okay, then the second type of bad view or wrong view is called Akiryavada, which means literally the view or doctrine of not doing. And this view is expressed in the thesis that if somebody, it seems very similar to Attikavada, the way it's expressed. If somebody goes around killing, murdering, slaughtering, robbing, he commits no evil, so there's not doing of anything evil. And if somebody goes around practicing charity, giving, generosity, self-restraint, to mental development, there's no doing of anything good. Okay, and the Buddha opposes that view with his doctrine of Kiryavada, the view of doing. That is, when we do certain actions, we are doing what is bad, unwholesome, harmful. When we do other actions, we are doing what is good, what is beneficial, what is helpful. And then the third type of strong wrong view is called a Hetukavada, which is the view that there is no cause, no condition for the corruption or defilement of living beings, and no cause, no reason for the purification or spiritual development of living beings. This view holds that people are determined by fate, that their destiny is sort of predetermined, and whether they do things that we consider to be wholesome or unwholesome, good or bad, they each have their own process of development that they have to go through, and whether one is good or bad, when that predetermined time comes, one will attain liberation. And then the Buddha opposes this with the view that there is a cause, there is a reason for beings to become defiled or corrupted, And there is a cause, there is a reason for beings to become purified, to develop, to become enlightened. And so the Buddha is one who teaches the existence of causes and conditions. Okay, so that's the basic distinction of wrong views and the Buddha's right view. But on top of this, then the Buddha teaches also what's called, these are like the worldly right views, the view that there is the doing of karma and an existence beyond death. There is the doing of what is harmful and what is beneficial. And there are causes and conditions for spiritual development and for enlightenment. So those are what we call the mundane right views, the right views that operate within the range of the world. But then the Buddha also teaches what we might call the world-transcending or liberating right view. This is the right view that leads to ultimate liberation. And that would be the view of the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. Okay, so the Buddha makes a clear distinction between wrong views and right views and different types of right views. But the Buddha's attitude towards views is different from that of the, you might call the dogmatists. The Buddha teaches that one uses the view not as something to which one clings, but rather as a kind of lens for understanding the nature of the world and as a basis for spiritual cultivation. And so the proper attitude towards views within the Buddha's framework of understanding is that views have, you might call them a pragmatic function or a strategic function. The purpose of the view is to guide us first in our conduct, in our day-to-day life, so that we act in ways that will accord with the principles, the laws that govern the working of reality, that govern the way the process of karma and its fruits will unfold. And then one uses the world-transcending right view, the view of the Four Noble Truths, as a guide for cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path. And then when one reaches the end or goal of the Noble Eightfold Path, then in a sense, one transcends all views. But at the same time, one will use that right view in order to teach and to guide others. But a distinction is made in the attitude towards views between clinging to views and holding them to be absolutely accurate models of the nature of reality, and then pounding them dogmatically and seeking to convince and convert others to one's views. Okay, that's the distinction between that attitude and the attitude of using views as skillful devices for understanding, for cultivation, and for liberation. And so when one uses the view as a guide for cultivation and liberation, then one uses it without clinging to it, without identifying with the view. You know, I think that's the main problem, is that one identifies with views, so that one takes the view to be mine, even invests oneself in the view. So when the view is questioned or challenged, then one feels provoked to defend that view against others. So can there be a clinging even to Buddhist views?
Yes.
Who said yes? Do you want to elaborate on that? Take the microphone.
Yes. Elaborate on that?
Did you want to elaborate? Or give you a reason for that?
Well, it's really normal, it's very normal to have a brain be used or to be expended primarily in thoughts and emotions for a long time. And so one comes to Buddhism often via those vehicles, emotional need and then cognizing Buddhism, thinking about it. Therefore, as I think you mentioned last, I'm thinking of a different teaching of the 4 types of person who studies Buddhism. The one that just studies but doesn't practice. And that's how it can be just clinging to Buddhism, there being no practice, in my opinion.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah, I think you do sometimes see, especially if you've lived in a Buddhist country for some time, how people become proud of, I'm a Buddhist. And then if other religions present their view, then they feel compelled to defend the Buddhist view against the view of other religions. And then they become involved in arguments and debates. And not only between Buddhists and other religions, but even within Buddhism, there are different schools of thought. You know, in India, there were some 18 schools of thought, and at least some of them have passed down treatises in which they take up the views of the other Buddhist schools, and then they basically debate with them and try to refute them. So in the Theravada tradition, we have a text called Kata Vattu, which is translated as basis for discussion or basis for debate. And what it does is to take up the views of other Buddhist schools existing in India at that time, and then tries to argue against them, usually appealing to texts. But the other schools also had their texts in which they debate with all of the other schools. And so we get this sense that each one has to defend its fundamental standpoint against the fundamental standpoints of other schools. Yeah.
I remember last week you may have said that mamankara comes from the root word ma, to measure.
Not the mamankara. Mana comes from the root meaning, mana means conceit. It comes from the root word meaning to measure.
So and maybe that also supports this idea that a person can cling to a Buddhist. It's adding to what you just said, or needlessly adding to what you just said, adding the measurement, the value addition, clinging to the meaning of the measure, the value addition to a thought, to a...
Yeah, well, certainly people build up conceits on the basis of their views. And so they think, my view must be the best, and therefore, because I hold this view, I must be the best, or at least better than others. Okay, let us continue. Okay, so Dighanaka has said, if this view of mine were acceptable to me, it too would be the same. It too would be the same. So he seems to be, at least the way I read it, suggesting here that he's not even clinging to this view of his that nothing is acceptable to me, but he's sort of claiming that he's able to put aside his view or to hold his view only tentatively as a kind of pragmatic device for getting free of the knots and tangles of view. Okay, but the Buddha says here, there are plenty in the world who say, it too would be the same. It too would be the same. In other words, they claim to be able to overcome their view. and yet they do not abandon that view, and they take up still some other view. According to the commentary, again, it's a bit obscure, but what the commentary says is that not only don't they abandon their view, they still continue to hold on to their view, and then they further elaborate on that view, or take up, or make further distinctions within their view. But anyway, for the most part, what the Buddha is saying is that there are some, there are plenty in the world who say it too would be the same, as though they've overcome the attachment to view, and yet they still continue at some level to cling to their view, and then they take up some other view. But there are few in the world who say it too would be the same, it too would be the same, and to abandon that view and do not take up some other view. So it seems that the few in the world would be those who are able to give up the clinging to their view without taking up some other view to replace it. Does this seem tenable so far? You know, the sutta is, again, it's quite obscure, and I have to interpret as I go along. Even the commentarial explanation doesn't seem very convincing to me. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to speak about how the ascetics of different convictions because of their clinging to their views, become involved in conflicts and disputes, which is one of the dangers that the Buddha sees in holding to views. So he says, there are some ascetics and Brahmins who have the doctrine and view, everything is acceptable to me. This would seem to me to be those who are completely affirming the world. You know, they can't affirm every view, but they're saying that everything in the world is acceptable to me. Maybe it's a view of like loving everything in the world. And there are some who have the view that nothing is acceptable to me. I think here the Buddha is suggesting those who take the view that everything in the world is of misery, everything in the world is just a tangle of trouble and turmoil, and so I'm rejecting everything in the world. And then some take the view that some things are acceptable to me, some things are not acceptable to me. Okay, now the Buddha makes a distinction in these positions. He says, among these, the view of those recluses and Brahmins who hold the view, everything is acceptable to me. Those who are world affirmers, who accept or willing to endorse everything in the world. He says, this view is close to lust, close to bondage, close to delight, close to holding, close to clinging. So this view, which might seem to be intellectually sophisticated, trying to find some grounds for ultimate affirmation of the world, from the Buddha's standpoint, is on the side of clinging. But the view of those recluses and Brahmins who hold a doctrine and view that nothing is acceptable to me, the view of complete, say, world rejection, world denial, repudiation of everything in the world, this view is close to non-lust, non-bondage, non-delight, non-holding, non-clinging. And so we know that the ideals for the ascetics in the Buddha's time, and the Buddha was in that group, was to put an end to clinging, to attachment, to bondage. And so we have this kind of an opposition of these two positions. Everything is acceptable to me, everything is not acceptable. Usually they're seen as polar opposites, but the Buddha seems to be affirming, or at least approving to a greater extent, the view of those who say nothing is acceptable to me. How does this square with our ordinary understanding, our usual understanding of Buddhism? Because there's kind of a popular understanding of Buddhism which says that through the practice of mindfulness, one should come to be able to appreciate, live completely in the present, be able to appreciate everything that one is doing, everything one is experiencing. And yet here, it seems to be saying that the view that one should enjoy everything, experience everything, is on the side of clinging, the side of bondage. Doesn't it seem to be siding with the pessimists? With the kind of grouchy negativists, like Schopenhauer? Excuse me? Was somebody going to say something? Okay, Barbara was going to say something.
I'm reminded of the thing that says that we should have great faith and great doubt. And this one is in the territory of the great doubt. That it's not really accepting anything, and that's how we study. We continue and see what turns out.
Yeah,
The
that's...
value of doubt.
Excuse me?
The value of doubt, but not accepting.
Yeah, so that is used in the Zen tradition, with the idea that first one has great faith, that there's a possibility of reaching a breakthrough, which is called enlightenment. And then one has great doubt, which is not like ordinary doubt, but it's using the koan or the huato in order to raise a kind of perplexity, which then becomes a basis for that breakthrough. So I don't know whether that's quite the same as what the Buddha is saying here. But I have to say, it's not really 100% clear to me what the Buddha is saying here. But he does seem to be at least approving the view, you might call the negative view, over the view of world affirmation. Let's say, Richard, you could pass the microphone back to Richard.
It strikes me that the Dighanaka's response seems to definitely imply clinging. He gets all excited when he sees that Gautama is saying something that reminds him of what he's saying. Right? Doesn't that imply that he really is clinging to it and is not doing what he's saying he's doing originally?
That seems that,
so...
Okay, did you want to add something? Katie?
I was thinking what I heard that it's the same thing in the opposite direction over, whereas the nihilist is presuming a condition that they really maybe don't know, but asserting that the opposite is to constantly sort of inseminate everything with this assumption of positivism, to also a form of conceit or gratifying conceit, and asserting a knowing that isn't actually there, asserting a conclusion which is very gratifying and sort of placating and resolving. I've either made the decision to be a nihilist or I've made the decision to be all things are in a positive realm, and it is a tremendous presumption, a needless presumption that's very calming.
Okay, possibly. But let us go on and see how this discussion works out. Okay, so when this was said, then, now it's on the next page, Dighanaka says, Master Gotama commends my point of view. Master Gotama recommends my point of view. So Dighanaka becomes happy at the Buddha's statement because he thinks that the Buddha is endorsing his position.
Why does Buddha calls him Agilasa?
Oh, I see. That was probably his actual family name or clan name. Whereas Dighanaka, which means long fingernails, was just the kind of sobriquet or just a nickname that had come to him. Okay, so now the Buddha goes on to take the third alternative, which is the view that some things are acceptable to me, some things are not acceptable to me. So he dissects that point of view when he says, the view of theirs about that some things are acceptable to them, that is close to lust or attachment, close to bondage, to delighting, to holding, to clinging, while the other part of their view, that some things are not acceptable to them, that is on the side of non-attachment, non-bondage,